Liu Qingge's entire body was stained with blood, large swathes covered with a deep and ghastly red. The wounds weren't just concentrated in one place, and a stream of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. It looked like he'd already stabbed himself with the sword, who knew how many times, yet his expression was both furious and crazed. It was obvious he was delirious in the midst of a qi deviation. Beneath the rays of dim yellow firelight, this picture was exceptionally horrifying. Shen Qingqiu momentarily forgot that this was still the dream realm and threw himself forward, wrenching Chen Luan's sword away. It had been staked into the center of Liu Qingge's heart, and with only a light touch from Shen Qingqiu, fresh blood splurted violently forth, filling his vision with red. At that, Shen Qingqiu's mind cleared a little, and he backed up 2 steps, only to bump into another person. He jerked his head around. Yue Qingyuan's head was lowered, gaze meeting his. Though their gazes met, those 2 eyes were empty and devoid of light. From his throat to his chest, his forelimbs and abdomen were all pierced with a forest of pitch-black arrows. Pierced with 10,000 arrows? All at once, Shen Qingqiu understood the meaning of these visions. These were their original deaths, the deaths that the original Shen Qingqiu had meant to cause with his own hands. Shen Qingqiu couldn't stand it anymore. He far preferred being outside, getting aggressively stared down by a circle of faceless people, to this sort of thing. He backed up in the direction from which he'd come, and he managed to brush those wooden doors. Feeling as if he'd been granted amnesty, Shen Qingqiu kicked the doors open and rushed outside. His mind was a mess, his footsteps confused as he tripped and staggered along, cutting a rather sorry figure. Every person on the street watched him in a deathly silence, and while he was disoriented, he crashed headlong into someone's chest. That person's hands swiftly came around to his back, gathering him into their arms. The other party was a little taller than him, slender and willowy, dressed in clothes as black as ink that exposed only a fair neck. Above that, a sinister mask covered their face. Shen Qingqiu hadn't yet spoken when a smiling voice came from above. "Shizun, be careful." He had no need to lift the mask to know whose face lay underneath. At once, Shen Qingqiu began to struggle. The other party didn't hold him by force, so getting free wasn't difficult. Only after retreating several steps and maintaining a safe distance did he right himself. "You created the city?" Shen Qingqiu asked. Luo Binghe casually removed the mask. His expression looked like he was sad that they couldn't keep playing hide-and-seek. "Correct. What does Shizun think?" Shen Qingqiu slowly nodded. You truly deserve to be called Mengmo's succeeding disciple." To be able to create an illusion this detailed, he feared it was nearly as good as the city Mengmo had created to trap them in all those years ago. Furthermore, it had so accurately grasped his lurking fears. Originally, Luo Binghe's mood had seemed rather good, but on hearing these words, the smile on his lips faded. "I'm not Mengmo's disciple." "Didn't you accept him as your master?" Shen Qingqiu asked, slightly curious. Luo Binghe held his silence for a while before he answered in a peeved tone. "I didn't." "All right then, if he didn't, he didn't." Shen Qingqiu didn't think there was any point wasting time on this. "Shizun, if you're willing to return on your own volition, you can ask for anything," Luo Binghe said. "Are you offering a plea bargain?" asked Shen Qingqiu. "So as long as I don't dissolve the blood mites within your body, it will be futile to flee." "Oh, is that so?" Shen Qingqiu smiled. "Then right now, why haven't you personally come to catch me?" Luo Binghe stiffened, sparks flashing in his eyes. At this reaction, Shen Qingqiu became even more sure Something has gone wrong with that sword of yours, right? He asked languidly.
Yes, the heavens smiled down on me.
After falling into the endless abyss, while within the stomach of a huge ancient beast, Luo Binghe had found a mythical sword that had been forged by a master demon blacksmith with an entire lifetime's worth of painstaking labor. This sword was called Xingmo sword, which meant heart demon.
The name alone tells you that it's something super dangerous, right?
And that was a must. The stronger the spiritual artifact, the harder it was to control. Since ancient times, Xingmo sword had passed through the hands of more than 100 masters, and all had been blessed geniuses from various races. Yet, despite this, none of them had been able to escape the same fate, and they had all died to this very blade, their own sword. Xingmo was a kind of weapon that lashed back against its wielder. If you could make it submit, it was a formidable weapon in your hand. But if one day you were unable to control the sword's evil tendencies, you would become no more than another blood sacrifice to its hunger. Only after starting the Demon Realm arc had the original Luo Binghe gone through this first bout of internal struggles, wherein he narrowly escaped Xingmo's recoil. After that, for the sake of solving this problem, he'd begun a, quote, side plot that lasted 500 chapters and involved collecting 8 or 9 more girls. But right now, with the plot in disarray, it seemed the recoil incident had also moved earlier. Xingmo's recoil was no joke. No wonder Luo Binghe hadn't given chase. He was busy secluding himself to recover, so he was unable to come and capture Shen Qingqiu in person. Suddenly, Luo Binghe grabbed Shen Qingqiu's shoulder and forcefully yanked. Rip.
Why again?
Luo Binghe's face was almost as dark as the bottom of a pot. Each word he spat out sounded like he'd first ground it between his teeth. Even if I can't come in person for now, Shizun shouldn't be too happy.
That doesn't mean you should tear my clothes.
Shen Qingqiu clutched the remaining fabric tightly and indignantly said, What are you doing? Is this your only method of humiliating others? It was clearly Shizun who humiliated me first. Satisfaction points, plus 50.
Bruh, you can't add points for that too. Gross. Why does this feel so sick?
When Luo Binghe's hand exerted force, the white robe's fabric disintegrated into pieces, drifting away in the wind. His anger still unappeased, he pressed toward Shen Qingqiu. His expression made Shen Qingqiu fear that there would be no end to this. He'd never known Luo Binghe to have crazy clothes-ripping tendencies, but of course he couldn't just sit there and resign himself to it. They exchanged 10 or so blows, quick and nimble. Luo Binghe could obviously easily assume the upper hand, but like a cat playing with a mouse, he patiently engaged Shen Qingqiu in close combat. Shen Qingqiu's movements were swift, but it seemed that in Luo Binghe's eyes, he was always one step behind. When he lashed out with a palm strike, Luo Binghe evaded within a hair's breadth every time, calm and unhurried. Then, as if reciprocating a polite gesture, he perfunctorily returned the blow. On top of that, the system was being extremely annoying, with satisfaction point notifications ringing without end. Plus 20, plus 30, plus 50, etc. The internal racket flooded Shen Qingqiu's brain. After several back and forths, it was Shen Qingqiu's turn to wear a dark face.
Where are you aiming? Why are you messing with me?
Shouldn't the goal of a fight be defeating the other party? This wasn't a fight. This couldn't even be considered sparring. It was basically harassment. As he thought this, Shen Qingqiu's concentration slipped and he used too much force, falling into Luo Binghe. This Luo Binghe didn't evade at all. He let Shen Qingqiu crash into his arms with a thud. His voice carried laughter, like his mood had risen once more. Shizun taught me this maneuver himself. When it comes to force, There's a time for restraint and a time for release, and one must above all else avoid losing one's balance. How could you forget that yourself? At this moment, Shen Qingqiu's mind was bombarded with a colorful explosion of, quote, little beast, unquote, ad nauseum.
Mother, this maneuver really was something he taught Luo Binghe. He still remembered that lesson not long after Luo Binghe had moved out of the woodshed. Though he was blessed with shitloads of raw talent and had come up with a fighting style through random experimentation, other than the handful of cutting and stabbing maneuvers every new disciple knew, he'd known absolutely jack shit about higher level techniques. After watching him practice a series of sword, palm, and foot techniques, Shen Qingqiu had held his forehead for a long time while Luo Binghe awaited his evaluation by his side, as anxious as he was nervous. Shen Qingqiu had been unable to bear hurting him and, after a long while, had finally squeezed out a single line. Pragmatic and quite flexible. In the name of correcting Luo Binghe's more tragic habits, Shen Qingqiu had put in a great deal of painstaking effort and given him daily private instruction. He had been unable to understand why a nudge wasn't enough. Given Luo Binghe's intelligence and comprehension, Shen Qingqiu shouldn't have needed to tell him anything more than once. But in reality, Luo Binghe was incredibly stubborn. He would immediately forget his lessons, no matter how tirelessly taught, and always used too much force. He had slammed into Shen Qingqiu's arms, who knew how many times, until Shen Qingqiu finally became angry. Are you doing this on purpose?
Unable to help himself, he had slapped the back of Luo Binghe's head, neither heavy nor light, and shouted, "How is this anticipating and defending against your enemy? You're basically throwing yourself into their arms." Only after this did Luo Binghe, face fully flushed, finally started practicing in earnest. He no longer dared to make mistakes so carelessly. But in the present, Luo Binghe was the one lecturing Shen Qingqiu on his incorrect stance.
Oh my goodness, what nonsense is this?
Shen Qingqiu felt like his dignity as a master had been challenged. He was about to counterattack when Luo Binghe's hand trailed downward, following the line of his spine. Goosebumps exploded down Shen Qingqiu's back in its wake.
Luo Binghe,
he said through clenched teeth. Satisfaction points, plus 100. Congratulations.
Congratulations, my ass.
Luo Binghe again plucked away a length of shredded white cloth. Seeing Shizun in this robe makes me awfully unhappy. It would be better to rip it all off.
Doesn't that mean he won't stop until I'm 100% naked?
Even if you hate me, there's no need to take it out on this robe, Shen Qingqiu said. Moreover, it's Gong Yixiao's. Luo Binghe's face fell. Shizun's the one who truly hates me. You're unwilling to associate with even a scrap of my clothing.
Why? Why were two grown men neurotically discussing a piece of clothing while surrounded by staring eyes? Luo Binghe, are you actually the sensitive type? I even patted your robe clean and folded it for you. What more do you want? It can't be that you wanted me to hand wash and return it to you personally.
Shen Qingqiu thought, his expressions shifting erratically. What is Shizun thinking? Luo Binghe asked at the sight. He added coolly, if it is about Gong Yixiao, let me advise Shizun. You need to think about him anymore. An ominous feeling rose in Shen Qingqiu's heart, and he asked in a forceful voice, what happened to Gong Yixiao? Plot-wise, Gong Yixiao being banished, forced, to defend a desolate regional border and deprived of any future prospects, was only supposed to happen after Luo Binghe and the little palace mistress slept together. But now the plot was all jumbled to the point where even airplane shooting towards the sky, the story's own father, would no longer recognize it. So, naturally, any scenario could have moved up. Shen Qingqiu had yet to hear Luo Binghe's answer when the faceless people nearby stirred. Originally, they had only vacantly stood there, watching blankly, as if they were mentally infirm or doing their own thing. Now, they started to steadily gather around him. Shen Qingqiu was squeezed into the center of the crowd, but he couldn't directly blast them away. He looked again toward Luo Binghe, whose brows were tightly furrowed, hand pressed to his temple, too preoccupied to notice anything else, as if he were enduring a mental assault. Shen Qingqiu had a sudden epiphany. In all likelihood, Xingmo had taken the chance to lash out and was trying to strike at Luo Binghe's mind. As Luo Binghe could no longer spare the energy to maintain the barrier, the dream realm was beginning to fall into chaos. If Shen Qingqiu didn't leave now, then when would he get the chance? If Luo Binghe couldn't expend any attention to stop him, so as long as Shen Qingqiu faced another illusion and overcame the related fears buried within his heart, he would be able to destroy this failing barrier. Just like that, Shen Qingqiu left. Luo Binghe's head hurt like it was splitting open, but he was unable to move. He could only yell, "How dare you take another step!" Shen Qingqiu took 10 steps. Afterward, he turned his head. "How's that?" Luo Binghe looked like he was about to cough up blood. He ground out each word, one by one. "Just you wait and see." Shen Qingqiu's gaze didn't falter. He spoke coldly and loftily. "Goodbye." "You think I'll just wait because you told me to? I'm not an idiot." To the side, Shen Qingqiu glimpsed another shop. He kicked open the doors and leapt through them. Whatever appeared this time, he was absolutely certain he could face it calmly. At the very least, his chance of success was higher than when facing Luo Binghe. The doors closed behind him, and it was like the clamor outside had been severed away by a sharp knife. Within a split second, it was all deathly silent. Shen Qingqiu held his breath and waited, soundless. After a long while, it was as if someone had lit a candle, and his surroundings slowly, flickeringly, lightened. Shen Qingqiu looked down, and he came face to face with a countenance that was both foreign and familiar. Before him knelt a frail-looking youth. The boy wore coarse clothes and was crouched bent over on the ground. It was a crestfallen pose, and his hands were tightly tied with a thick, rough rope. Though his face was deathly pale, his eyes were full of life. Shen Qingqiu met his gaze, unwavering. This category wasn't Shen Qingqiu's memory, but this face was indeed exactly like his. The only thing it was missing was a polish of time and cultivation. Instead, it possessed the inexperience of youth. This was Shen Qingqiu, yet it wasn't Shen Qingqiu. If he had to be obvious about it, this was Shen Jiu. Shen Qingqiu abruptly sat on a wooden slab. After startling awake, he took in his surroundings, and only then did he realize that he was lying within an abandoned residence. The sky was already bright, white light streaming through the worn-out window and cracks in the rice paper. Then he remembered. The night before, he'd wandered at random through the festival, and not long into his wander had he really found an old, uninhabited house. He'd originally only intended to rest a little, but by accident he had carelessly fallen asleep, allowing Luo Binghe to catch him within the dream realm. As Shen Qingqiu considered the illusion he'd seen just before the dream realm collapsed, he couldn't help but sink into thought. Though his and the original flavor's souls counted as two different people, in the end he was using someone else's body, so it made sense that there would be at least some influence from the prior owner. What he'd seen in the dream had likely been the original Shen Jiu's childhood memories. In a way, then he had cheated his way out, because those memories had absolutely no hold on the current Shen Qingqiu. Thus, he had been able to easily and effortlessly break free of them. Although in retrospect, Shen Qingqiu thought this was fairly suspicious, the Shenjiu within his dream had been tied up, so he'd assumed it was a memory from the time when Shenjiu was still held by human traffickers. However, he'd been in a room decorated with a soft carpet, numerous cabinets for keeping valuables, and the walls hung with calligraphy, which had lent it a noble air. It hadn't looked like a criminal's den, but rather it had unquestionably been a rich man's study. In other words, it looked like Shenjiu had not been as doted upon at the Qiu estate as Qiu Haitang had claimed.